Hello. Come in, do, and make yourselves at home. This is the History of Ideas podcast, where we tackle some of the biggest questions around. This week, we're wondering what makes me human. Enjoy the programme.
Are you afraid of death? That's a very interesting question.
Not afraid, more anxious.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely not.
No.
Who could say until you're really faced with it?
My name's Catherine Edwards, and I know I'm going to die.
It's a fact of life, and the more we ignore it, the harder it is to deal with it.
What makes me human? Well, one thing that definitely makes me human is the knowledge that one day I will die. It makes me feel scared, and of course I don't know when I'm going to die. But at the same time, if I considered what it would be like if I didn't face death, then it's actually really hard to imagine how different life would be.
What makes me human?
I teach and research ancient history at Birkbeck, and I'm particularly interested in what the Greeks and Romans had to say about the prospect of death. I've written a book called Death in Ancient Rome. Right, well, crowded onto the shelves in my office. I guess one of the authors who's most obviously present here is the Roman philosopher Seneca. And I'm particularly interested in Seneca's letters, which he wrote at the end of his life, after he was no longer advisor to the Emperor Nero, a role he'd filled for a number of years. But at this point in his life, he's thinking particularly about the prospect of death, partly because he's offended Nero, and Nero is notorious for bumping off anybody he doesn't agree with anymore, but also because he's older, he's suffered from ill health, and he becomes increasingly obsessed almost with the question of how to face the prospect of death.
Lucius Annaeus Seneca the Younger was a first-century Roman philosopher and Stoic, and an advisor to 3 generations of Roman emperor. In AD 65, Emperor Nero ordered him to kill himself over his supposed involvement in an assassination plot. As Seneca himself remarked, an emperor who had had his own mother killed would hardly hesitate at his teacher. But he was allowed to choose the manner of his death, an acknowledgement of his status.
The emperor's centurion arrived and gave Seneca the order, far from unexpected, that he should choose his way to die. Seneca chose to bleed to death, but before he embarked on that process, he gathered his friends around him and he reminded them of their philosophical education, of how they shouldn't be distressed because what was happening to him was not unexpected. And then he and his wife cut the veins in their arms. His wife's suicide in the end wasn't successful, and Seneca's death was a very long drawn out one, and it took him a very long time to die. And at that point he asked for poison. It was the same poison that had been taken by the philosopher Socrates centuries previously, condemned to death by the Athenians. So Seneca took poison, and even then he still he was still lingering on, and he only finally died after being placed in a hot bath. So it was a very long drawn-out death, but it was nevertheless one characterised by calm, even in the face of great pain. It was a real stoic death.
Seneca believed that we cannot live our lives well if we are preoccupied by the fear of death, a central idea of Stoicism. The best kind of death is not quick and painless, as we might expect, but one actively accepted by the dying subject.
What makes me human?
He really sees the fear of death as being, in some ways, the principal challenge facing each individual. But for him, a way to rise to that challenge is to think about preparing for the worst. So, and one of the ways in which you can prepare for the worst is to think about horrible things happening to you all the time. And here's the really important thought. Because death can happen at any moment, we need to use our time carefully, live each day attentively, as if it might be our last.
keep calm, and join in Stoic Week 2014.
One of the things we said about Seneca is that he was a Stoic. So the events surrounding Stoic Week back in November seemed a good occasion to gather some contemporary views about Stoicism and about death.
So we are here at Stoicism today, 2014. We've got over 300 people into Queen Mary in the East End of London for what I think is the biggest gathering of Stoics perhaps ever. An exciting day. Even Stoics get excited, and we're excited today.
The person you've just heard is Jules Evans, author of Philosophy for Life, and one of the prime movers behind the Stoic event.
I think what Seneca brought to death was this idea that we could somehow manage our death. We could, I think he uses the phrase, choose the script of your death. Somehow control it. Stoicism is a lot about trying to control the things you can control. In some ways, of course, death is the ultimate limit of our control, yet he thought we might be able to manage it, to have a good death. And he tried to stage manage his death very much, choosing the time of his death. So this idea that Stoics, when life gets too rubbish, you can choose to walk off the stage. You always have that choice. That choice always remains to you.
Stoics label pain and suffering as indifferent, unimportant. What really matters is our attitude. That, and only that, is something we can control. They say there's a big revival in Stoic numbers, so I was interested in what other attendees thought.
Stoicism helps me be more blunt with myself, I think.
And how this affected their views on death.
Like everybody, some anxiety about the prelude to death, the manner of it, pain, suffering, indignity. But death, no, it's just the end of the line, isn't it? But I am a doctor, so I've been around death since I was 18 years old.
Well, I remember when I was a child, I was very afraid of death for religious reasons, funnily enough. And I think as you get older and you see other people passing away, then that gives you an opportunity to come to terms with the concept. That I can say for sure.
Well, it's the one thing that we literally cannot control. So there is very little point in being afraid. It's inevitable, so what can we do?
I think it's quite unusual in the modern world to encounter people consciously thinking about the prospect of death in that way. Here's Jules Evans again.
Being Stoic is about really looking life in the eye and then learning to accept it. And that includes very much looking death in the eye. And there are different ways you might do that. You might remind yourself of death to make sure your ego doesn't get out of control. So, for example, when a Roman general was on parade in triumph through the streets of Rome, with the whole population of Rome cheering away, treating him like a god, someone would stand behind him and whisper to him, "All this will pass, you are nothing but dust," so that their ego didn't get out of control, so they didn't think that they were a god. Reminding yourself of death in that kind of Roman way is quite a good way of keeping your feet on the ground, remembering that you are human, we are dust, so keep your feet on the ground.
We caricature the Stoics as being completely impervious to emotions. It's certainly true that the Stoics put a lot of emphasis on self-control, on the damage that excessive emotion can do. But at the same time, there's an awful lot of admission of human weakness in Seneca, and pain as well. I mean, the frailties of the human body are something that are a real preoccupation in Seneca's letters. So he kind of gives us these vignettes of heroic individuals who have managed to display incredible bravery in the face of pain. There's this very sort of Roman hero, Mucius Scaevola, who sort of snuck into the enemy camp in this is the early days of Roman history. He snuck into the enemy camp, tried to assassinate the enemy leader, failed in his attempt. But what he does that's really heroic is then to burn off his hand in a brazier to show just how brave the Romans really are. And of course, after that demonstration, the enemy leader is just kind of pretty stunned. So Seneca reflects on these things and shows us, his readers, how to reflect on them and how to use them in a positive way. So you can kind of turn yourself into a heroic figure in your own eyes, and maybe that's enough to give your life meaning, even when you're really suffering.
Are you afraid of death?
No, I'm not afraid of death. It's just like breathing in and breathing out, and when you die you breathe out and you just don't breathe in again.
This is Emeritus Professor of Ancient Thought, Christopher Gill.
It is part of our natural process.
And the key word here is natural, which is why I want to end on one final point. Growing and then dying. This is the natural trajectory of human life. Knowing that is what gives it purpose and poignancy. Even those who know death is very near can still be capable of enjoying their last days, last hours. Indeed, they have a heightened sense of the value of time. If you go back further in time, centuries before Seneca, then you come to that great poem of death, the Iliad. In its simplest terms, this tells the story of the Trojan War and the heroes who fought on both sides, most notably Achilles for the Greeks and for the Trojans, Hector, whom Achilles kills. The poem gives us descriptions of the deaths of 318 individual warriors, and fear of death dogs all the heroes of the Iliad. The poem concludes with Hector's father, King Priam, going to Achilles to ransom the body of his dead son. It's a tragic end, but Hector has achieved great deeds and shown great courage. Hovering over the action are the gods. These gods share many human qualities. They feel desire, they feel anger, they even feel pity. They scheme and they plot and they love, but they never die. Unlike the warriors and their families, they have no real courage, and their love for each other is not tempered in any way by the possibility of death. We are human, they are not.
Thought-provoking stuff. That was the History of Ideas podcast, brought to you by the lovely people at BBC Radio 4 and the Open University. And if that programme left your brain hungry for more ideas, you can listen to the whole series on the BBC iPlayer. You can also watch a whole host of brilliant short animations narrated by Harry Shearer, Gillian Anderson, and even yours truly, delving into the minds of some of the world's greatest thinkers. Find out about the golden ratio, perhaps, or whether we really have free will. Just search online for History of Ideas. See you next time.